Funding for higher education decreased. Campuses found themselves with an oversupply of everything from beds to doctorates. And the humanities bore the brunt. Departments weren't able to hire new colleagues, and graduate students prepared for a job market that hardly existed. When I finished, there was exactly one job in the United States in my field. Each of the disciplines in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, just to make things more interesting, embarked on a turbulent period of intellectual self-examination in the 1970s and 1980s. To many, the leading disciplinary fashions of the 1950s and 60s, the new criticism, functionalist sociology, consensus history, rational choice, behavioralism, seemed hollow, completely uncritical of themselves and of the purposes they served. Instead, thinkers who offered alternatives to these American traditions of hopeful and ameliorative humanities, made sense to younger faculty and graduate students. Anti-foundationalists, skeptics of disciplinary conventions, and European intellectuals who denied the very concept of the human won large followings. Every humanities discipline, in its own way, struggled to define its central purposes and larger mission. And at the same time, in a confluence of profound consequence, millions of women, people from underrepresented minorities, and people born abroad entered the U.S. higher education system while the number of white American male students declined. Faculty demographics slowly began to follow. Multicultural understanding and gender identities became widespread topics of interest. New majors and centers and programs and institutes, many of them interdisciplinary and demanding of resources, arose across the country. So you have this intellectual ferment meeting the institutional ferment of a greatly broadened body of students. And you heard today in this meeting what that intersection looks like. Now I think what's been added since then is the profound internationalization that ties together a far broader understanding of the humanities than existed not long ago, maybe before 9/11. It seems that there has been a sort of explosion of interest in all this. We can barely keep up with all the interest in things international at my school. So in all these things combined, and it seemed that we're both in crisis and at the beginning of something really exciting and new. And it seems that the old people in my department just don't get it. You know, it seems like they are actually resistant to liberating perspectives, that they want to hold on to these older ideas. Undergraduates showed little interest in disciplines that seemed splintered and unsure of themselves, that even individual faculty members seemed to be struggling with what exactly we were. Best-selling books, some from inside the academy itself, assailed the anti-traditional humanists as out of touch with both the Western tradition and the American triumph over communism. Even the National Endowment for the Humanities, heavily politicized from the right, raged against those it had been created to sustain. If it had become morning again in America in the early 1980s, it was pretty dark in the English and history departments. And then something surprising and generally unnoticed happened. In 1987, the very year that Alan Bloom bemoaned the betrayal of Western civilizations by humanities professors and the closing of the American mind, undergraduate enrollments in the humanities began another ascent. The number of humanities degrees mounted for 5 straight years, quite vertically, paused briefly in the mid-1990s, and then began another ascent to the present. The proportions were not those of the Golden Age, and some other fields grew more rapidly, but the numbers hardly suggested a loss of interest by students in what we teach. That's not the story we've been telling ourselves. I want to pause for a minute. Why does it feel to the contrary? Now, some of the challenges began to work out. Departments found ways that you don't have to choose between I'm a theorist or I'm something else. People began to realize, you know, that's interesting. That talks to what I'm doing. I'd never thought of that before. And they began to put behind them some of these battles that had wasted so much energy and goodwill. Disciplines incorporated their skeptics, appointing people who specialized in theory or critical studies and cementing their place in the conversations. And it turns out that the students of this much broader array of backgrounds than before found that exciting and interesting, that they would assume a critical perspective, that they came into it sort of born with the knowledge that humanists had discovered in the 1970s and 1980s. At the same time, service learning of expanding humanities outside the classroom came to seem a commonsensical thing to do. So the earlier crisis of the humanities, in some ways, in remarkably short time, has become institutionalized and internalized. And some may think domesticated, but what it means is that we've seen rapid fire change, really like different strata that have been stacked on one another, and we are the inheritors of all of those. So here's the surprising thing. The relative position of the humanities within colleges and universities stabilized in the late 1980s and has not changed appreciably in the last 20 years. Enrollments in business programs still flowed about, and it's interesting again to hear what the students were talking about. Finance, awesome. English, hey, sorry, man. You know, you hear that across America, right? And so the business enrollments have hovered about 10 percentage points above all other undergraduate degrees. And vocational programs still attract growing numbers of students. But the social sciences, the natural sciences, social services, and humanities each consistently enroll about 12% of undergraduates. The humanities occupy the middle of the pack on most measures of disciplinary health, from the ethnic and gender diversity of faculty and students to the salaries and degree of satisfaction of graduates. So we feel a decline because we look around and it seems always that somebody else is getting the new building. You know, doesn't it? Or did you hear how much they got for summer research leave? Or did you hear about that new latte maker they have, or whatever? You know, I've often thought that universities are like that M.C. Escher drawing, in which it's like this, you know, optical illusion that everybody can look down on everybody else. It's kind of an amazing thing where there's a sense of we're perpetually falling behind somebody else who has an in, maybe with the president or the dean or something who's getting that happen. But despite the stability implied in the aggregate numbers, the humanities in the U.S. continue to change deeply. While the proportion of English majors has remained relatively high and relatively constant, what it means to study English today is very different than it was in 1998 or 1988 or 1978. An English class may now well explore literature from Africa or India. It may focus on television or film or video games or comic books. It may look a lot like a history course. And a history course may look a lot like an English course. And I think in some ways that's the ferment in which this institute grows, that people are recognizing all these connections and to some extent the arbitrariness of our disciplinary boundaries. Let me pause here. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna. I'm not. There's one part of this crisis that is profoundly real, and that is the crisis of our graduate students. The young people now who are finishing with degrees, with the intersection of the financial crisis at the same time that you do not have growth in the humanities, is heartbreaking. And we should be thinking, the professional organizations, what is it that we do? And one of the things that I want to suggest today is that we're going to have to think in more expansive ways about who we are and what we do and what our expertise means. So as you can see, our institutions have changed plenty. They've changed profoundly. And back to my theme. Humanists are famous for being resistant to institutional change. I will tell you, I was at a very large meeting of all presidents and provosts, which may be an alarming concept to many of you. But we got together, and I was saying I was giving this talk, and actually it's before I said I was giving this talk, and somebody was talking about trying to get something passed, and they said, and it's always, of course, it's the historian in the faculty meeting who stands up and says, you know, I said, really, is that your experience? And everybody at the table just laughs. Of course. It's always the humanists who are resisting whatever you're trying to put in place. That's not the case at the University of Richmond, where everybody cooperates on everything with equal amount of energy. One reason that humanists would resist innovation is that, by and large, the innovations over the last several generations have come at our expense. The expansion of pre-professional training, of schools of education and social work and business and leadership and the like have diverted institutional attention and often resources and, just as important, identity. I think that's what I heard this first panel talking about. We are a sister institution. What is the place of the liberal arts, of the humanities, at a place where other fields are so attractive, where young people are so precocious and so eager to make a change in the world. When you're a liberal arts university, how do you honor that and keep it alive in the 21st century, as the title of that session went. Innovation has often come in the guise of management speak and managerial intrusion. I have never done that, but I've known other people who have. Not here, somewhere else. As the humanities have become equated with skills rather than knowledge, our ranks have been replaced with adjuncts and other temporary workers, including our own graduate students who don't have permanent jobs. That's important, as the content of what we do has been diminished in favor of the skills we teach. It lowers the threshold of our expertise. So these innovations have in fact come at our expense, and there's no reason to downplay that. The danger is that we will equate all change with decline from that golden age, and we will remove ourselves from the possible benefits of other kinds of innovation. I feel certain that if we do not adapt our best tradition to our times, we will suffer as a result, and so will our institutions, our communities, and our culture. So the first step then would be to clarify any innovations we actually desire. What, other than the restoration of a time that is not returning, do we want and need? And I think that's an important first step, to recognize that that particular concatenation of demographic and economic and political and state change is not going to come again in that form. So let's imagine, what do we want in the world that we inhabit now? How do we work with the momentum of the social changes of our time rather than merely trying to stand athwart them? How do we even try to shape and benefit from those changes? We know we change individual lives in our classrooms, the most precious places in America, every day. We need to remain confident that what we possess as ours is worth defending in every way and worth celebrating. So I think maybe one collateral risk of the way that I'm preparing to talk, is that we would diminish the things that we already have. We have so much more time with young people than the time they spend watching movies. They see that movie, it comes and goes, we resent that, but we can talk with them for 2.5 hours at a stretch. You know, some of my research, extensive research as dean and president at cocktail parties and football game tailgatings, has shown, and this is frankly a discovery. I thought alumni, I love them when they're here, but when they go out, I don't really, but then you start talking to them and they come and they'll say, you know, what I remember is Dr. this or that in this class. Every one of them remember a faculty member and a class. That's what we're about. So we don't want to think about what we don't have and lose confidence in what we do. But I think also might as well admit, and some of them among those alumni from some other school, not mine, who we will never persuade. And I would just encourage us not to waste our energy on it. Whether they're 18, pitying somebody for majoring in the literature of the world, or 38, too busy making a career to be thinking about reflection, or 88, some people simply do not believe and cannot be made to believe that what we teach has much value. Perhaps they never had their minds touched by a book when they were a child, or perhaps they are not very reflective because they imagine themselves as doers, or perhaps they simply never had an excellent teacher in one of our fields. Whatever the cause, they are impervious to our charms. I was trapped for 5.5 hours with a girlfriend of my brother-in-law who was completely impervious to any argument that I might make, and I'm still scarred by the experience, and that's why I feel compelled, because I can say a lot of words in 5.5 hours, and she still didn't do it. We can still be friends with them,